Good morning and welcome to our Wednesday class. This week, we're doing weeds. This class was originally presented by Master Gardener Don Peshka and myself, Thomas Bowles. We had a little bit of trouble with the video, and so I'm re-recording this. Let's get started. Is this a weed? That's a good question. For some people, yes, it's a weed and it must be killed. For others, it's not a weed, it's an integral part of the landscape. What that really means is why that's important to us is to understand that a weed is just a plant out of place. And what you consider to be a weed, somebody else may not. So a weed is a weed in the eye of a beholder. And as Emerson said, a weed is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. Generally, when we talk about weeds, they typically have large numbers of seeds that are viable for many years. Some seeds can remain in the soil, viable, just waiting to germinate for in excess of 10 years. A lot of our weeds have really deep roots, which make them less susceptible to drought and much more difficult to pull out. And those root reserves also make it much more difficult to kill using herbicides. Some of our weeds will spread by runners, either stolons. Stolons are horizontal stems above ground, or by rhizomes, which are a creeping underground stem. Also need to think about the life cycle of weeds. A lot of our weeds that we have problems with are annuals. They seed, grow, flower, and die in one season, generally in the winter or summer. Perennials are those that live more than 2 years, and they can be woody or herbaceous. The classic, everybody's enemy perennial weed in Northern Virginia is Bermuda grass. Although in some areas of the country, it's considered a viable turf grass. And biennials are typically a 2-year life cycle. First year, it produces a rosette. The second year, it produces a flower stalk, and then it dies after flowering. And we have some of those weeds as well, although we see a lot of those more in agriculture than in the lawn. This publication, Common Turf Weeds, is available through our office if you email mastergardener@pwcgov.org and ask for the Common Turf Weeds publication. We can send that to you. This is a good publication because it gives you a lot of the common weeds that we see throughout the year. The one we have here, of course, is Poa annua, which is annual bluegrass, sometimes just referred to as Poa. It's out right now, and it's one of the weeds we'll talk about in a little bit. There are lots of different ways to handle weeds. We'll talk about these a little bit more, but mechanical, cultural, and chemical are the ones that you're probably going to deal with the most. It's really hard to clean up weed seeds, and we don't really have good biologicals that are going to come and just eat the weeds. Some practices that we want to think about for weed management. Decide what your threshold is for a weed. If you can live with it, great. If you can live with some of it, how much? ID the plant. In order to control a weed, you need to know what it is. You need to know where it's found. You need to know where in its life cycle it's most susceptible to control. If you have weeds that you can't identify, you can always send pictures into your local extension office, and we're happy to identify weeds and give control recommendations if needed. So let's talk about some of these controls. Cultural controls include minimizing the conditions that weeds prefer. That is, some weeds prefer wet spots, some weeds prefer really compacted soil, some weeds prefer really undernourished soil. The best way, control-wise to deal with weeds, especially annual weeds, is to mow high and have a thick canopy that will shade out any weed seeds that may germinate. In some areas, turf isn't the right plant for the right place, and so ground covers or mulch are a much better option for covering the soil and preventing weeds. When you do use turf, it's important to meet their cultural needs to keep them healthy. A healthy, thick turf is your best defense against weeds. It may not get all of them, but it will reduce the weed population a great deal. Aeration is another tool that you could use. Aeration is kind of a double-edged sword. In high traffic areas, it's valuable because it reduces compaction, and so it discourages the weeds that like compacted soil. On the other hand, aeration can also bring up weed seeds. So if you aerate, you want to give it a week or so, scout for new weeds, pull those quickly, and you'll be okay. When we talk about chemical controls, one thing we need to understand is the selectivity of these herbicides. They can either be selective, which means they'll control some species without affecting other species. Typically, in a turf situation, we're looking at a broadleaf weed control product applied to the turf that will kill weeds, broadleaf weeds, but won't do anything to your turf if used according to label instructions. Then we have the non-selective options, and these will harm anything. And glyphosate, which used to be Roundup, is probably the best example of that. You spray glyphosate on your lawn, you're going to kill the weeds, but you're also going to severely damage, if not kill, your grass. So it's important to look at the product and understand the product before you buy it. Again, a weed is just a plant out of place. Keep in mind they're very hardy and they're good competitors. Some of them have allelopathic effects, which means that they produce hormones that discourage other plants from growing around them. And many of these are spread by both seeds and vegetative runners. Why would we control weeds? Well, they compete for water, nutrients, light, and space that our turf grass could use. They make the turf look ununiform, and that distracts from the appearance of the lawn. On sports fields, there's safety concerns, and they can harm insects and diseases that will attack your grass. And some people are allergic to certain weeds. So we want to suppress weeds and promote a healthy turf. We do that by soil testing, adjusting the pH as needed, using the right rate of fertilizer at the right time. The biggest mistake most people run into when fertilizing their lawn is listening to the fertilizer companies. They have national campaigns in the springtime that say, fertilize your lawn now. Well, here in Virginia, that's not always your best option. There are reasons to fertilize in the spring, and if you fertilize in the spring, you want to fertilize lightly. In other parts of the country, spring is a good time to fertilize, but not here in Virginia. You want to overseed regularly. Keep in mind that your turf grass, although it's a perennial, doesn't live forever. So you want to overseed every now and again to keep the plant numbers high and replace those plants that have reached their end of life, so you reduce bare spots and keep a thick, healthy turf. Measure your turf, calibrate your spreaders. You need to know how much turf you have, because recommendations for chemicals, recommendations for chemicals, whether it's pesticides or fertilizers, are given in quantity per 1,000 square feet. And so you really have to know how much you have, otherwise you could be under-applying or over-applying. Again, you want to mow high. The higher you mow within the given range of a particular turf, the better off you are in most cases. You want to improve surface drainage, and sometimes you can do that by aeration, and sometimes you need to do that by working the soil really, really intensely. And what I mean by that is applying lots of compost over successive seasons to feed the soil and let the microbes do the heavy lifting for you in terms of making the soil much more aerated. Also, you want to avoid shallow irrigation. You want to water deeply and infrequently. If you're going to water your lawn, it takes about 625 gallons of water per inch per 1,000 square feet. And an inch of water is what the turf needs every week. So you can either let nature do it, try and keep your grass alive by supplementing it with water, or you can let nature take its course and it will go dormant. It will provide enough water in most cases for the grass to survive the summer, and you don't have to go and add irrigation. So you either irrigate and keep the plants functioning and growing during the summer, which will stress them, or you choose not to irrigate and let them go dormant and let them sleep through the summer. Weeds on the webs, these are some publications which are handy for weed ID and for pest management. Keep in mind anything you see that comes from an out-of-state source, any control recommendations, any chemical control recommendations, I should say, may not be legal in Virginia. Each state has its own pesticide laws. So if you're looking up a publication from the University of Maryland, what they recommend may not be legal. You can always check with your local extension office to see what the state pesticide regulations are, so you know what you can and can't apply. So let's take a little weed walk. So here we have a patch of ground, and the picture from the vehicle was taken at a stop, just as a point of reference. But here we have, grassy areas, and if you look at them, they look green. The one in the foreground there on the upper right, it's a little bit of yellowing. One on the lower right has a little bit of browning, and that's actually from compost that's been applied. The one on the left, it looks green. It's passable. It's relatively uniform. Some people, that's all they want. Some people would not like that, because when they get up on it, they would see that this area is not just fescue, but it also has Bermuda grass in it. And that Bermuda grass is something they can't live with, because when it becomes cooler, that Bermuda grass is going to go dormant and it's going to look out of place. So let's talk about grasses. The weed grass that we see most right now is POA, or annual bluegrass. It's a winter annual. It's just starting to come into flower in this part of Virginia. This is what it looks like without being in flower. And POA is one of those things that really stands out, and it sticks out in the lawn like a sore thumb, and that's one of the reasons why most people don't like it. Now, there are a couple ways that you can deal with it. The best way to deal with POA is to have a thick, healthy lawn. However, if you're bothered by POA year after year, in late fall, you can apply a pre-emergent crabgrass preventer, and that should take care of most of the POA coming up in the late fall and in the early spring. Stiltgrass is an early germinating summer annual. About now is the time to control stiltgrass with a crabgrass preventer. A lot of these pre-emergents are labeled as crabgrass preventers, but they tend to work on all of our grasses, both weed grasses and turf grasses. So that's one thing to consider when you're seeding. But stiltgrass you probably won't see until April. But if you treat it now, you should be able to nip that in the bud. Stiltgrass gets its name from the stilts it produces that help it spread along as it crawls along the ground. And that's a close-up of one of the stilts. Crabgrass is probably the most prolific wheatgrass in Virginia. Crabgrass is a sprawling grass, doesn't grow uniformly out. This is a mature crabgrass. This is a young crabgrass, and a lot of times crabgrass will have that purplish coloring in the center of the plant. The time to put pre-emergent down for crabgrass is in between when forsythia comes into full bloom and when it drops half of its petals. When it drops half of its petals, it's also about the time that native dogwoods come into full bloom. So that gives you kind of a secondary thing to look for. When you're applying pre-emergent, make sure you're applying just pre-emergent, not nitrogen, along with that pre-emergent, because otherwise you'll end up adding too much nitrogen at the wrong time of year, and that'll cause problems for you. And there we have crabgrass in fescue. This is goosegrass, which germinates a little bit after crabgrass, but we still put down pre-emergent at the same time we would if we were treating for crabgrass. It has a more regular spoke-like growth pattern coming out of the center. Typically it's white in the center, but not always. Foxtail is another warm season annual grass that we run into. It usually germinates much later than crabgrass, although if we're applying crabgrass preventer correctly, we can oftentimes take out goosegrass before it germinates as well. Another weed grass, depending on your point of view, is nimblewill. Nimblewill is perennial. It's a warm season grass. It's very shade tolerant. And nimblewill is a native plant. Nimblewill is considered a weed in most yards. And the reason why warm season grasses tend to be considered weeds is because they have a long dormancy period in our area. And so they're kind of a tannish straw color much of the year. Nimblewill also has the disadvantage of it's a little bit hard to get nimblewill established, but once you do, it does spread fairly well. This is a good choice if you've got a shady area that gets a lot of use, either from children or just general walking, or if you've got dogs running through the area, playing and such. This is what nimblewill looks like right now. That's what it's going to look like in the summer. Here we have Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is an extremely aggressive perennial warm season grass. It's sometimes called wiregrass. It is a very weedy grass. In parts of the country, it's used as turf, but in this part of the country, we consider it a weed, except occasionally on sports fields. And this is what dormant Bermuda grass looks like in a fescue lawn. This was taken about 2 weeks ago, so we're looking at beginning of March, end of February. That's what it's going to look like. It's not dead, it's just dormant. Here we have the unusual situation where the warm season grass is the turf grass and the cool season grass is the weed. So here we have a picture of a house that's got zoysia for its lawn, and all that green you see in there is primarily tall fescue. And so tall fescue is the weed. Here we have an issue that two neighbors are going to have to sort out. We have zoysia on the right and tall fescue on the left. And you can see that the crisp line between the two properties is no longer crisp. There are parts where tall fescue has the advantage and there are parts where the zoysia has the advantage, and you can see that's a wavy line right now. And that's one issue with warm season grass. As your turf lawn, if your neighbors don't have warm season grass, you're going to get into perhaps difficult conversations about managing your grass. We'll talk about nutsedge briefly. Nutsedge we don't really have to worry about until late spring. It's a summer annual. Nutsedge is this light-colored grass-looking area. It has triangular stems. Nutsedge is best controlled by pulling it before it has 5 leaves. Once it has 5 leaves, it's got nutlets in it, or nutlets that have formed in the ground. When you pull the plant, those nutlets snap off and stay in the ground, and they'll resprout from that. This is an easy weed. If you get it early enough, you can control it by hand pulling. Let's talk broadleaf weeds. There are lots of them, and we won't get to every one of them. Ground ivy. Ground ivy is one of my favorite ground covers, actually. It does well in shade. It's a mint, so it can be aggressive, but not too aggressive. I kind of like the way it smells when you mow it. Ground ivy, though, is difficult to get control of chemically. So if you don't like ground ivy, if you're scouting your lawn, if you see it, get rid of it quickly. If you like ground ivy, one thing to be aware of is that in the wintertime, it often will bronze, but it will recover back to this fairly quickly once it warms up. This is wild violet. Wild violet is a cool season perennial that dies back to the ground over the winter and then resprouts. Wild violet is exceptionally difficult to get rid of. Honestly, digging it up is probably the best way to go, although it spreads by rhizomes, and it's important that you get all of the rhizome when you're trying to dig it up. This is one of those things where you either learn to live with it or you get very aggressive in getting it out. Hairy bittercress is another weed that we see. This is a cool season annual. It starts when it's younger. It has a rosette. As it gets older, it produces flower spikes with these nice little white flowers. And then as it matures, it forms these long, thin pods that you can see on the lower right. Those are seed pods. They're extremely sensitive to touch. And so hairy bittercress doesn't drop seed. It shoots seed. And so it also has the other problem of it can germinate and go to being ready to let loose seed in a very short period of time. So this is one of those things that, you see it come up, you blink, and all of a sudden it's mature. So this is one you want to get early. It's really easy to hand pull, however. This is corn speedwell. It's a form of veronica. It produces little blue or purple flowers. Right now it's in bloom in much of Northern Virginia. It's a very pretty ground cover by itself, but most people don't like it in their lawn. More speedwell that hasn't flowered. On the left, you're looking at it from above. On the right, you're looking at it from a low angle. Common chickweed is another cool season annual. This is a cool season annual that usually doesn't really get going until mid to late spring. But if you look around carefully, you can see that it's already germinated here in Northern Virginia. It produces little white flowers. It is edible as long as you're not applying chemicals to it. This is its cousin, mouse ear chickweed. It's a perennial in our area. It's got these fuzzy leaves. It's a little bit harder to control than common chickweed, but again, it can be hand pulled. Here we have two weeds that we run into quite a bit in the area. One is dandelion, and in this picture, we've got a dandelion that's reemerging in the spring. Dandelions have very strong taproots, and they store a lot of food, and they'll die back in the winter sometimes, and sometimes they'll stay green in the winter, but they will come back in each spring. And control-wise, you can pull those out, particularly on a day when the soil's moist. I usually grasp it by the base of the rosette and twist and pull. That usually gets most of the root out. If you have to use herbicides, ironically, the best time to kill dandelions with herbicides is in the fall. And that's because the dandelions are taking a lot of the energy coming from the leaves and storing it for the winter into the root. And when you apply an herbicide that's systemic, that is absorbed by the leaves and translocates into the root, this is the time to use it. Oxalis or wood sorrel is another common weed that we run into. It's relatively easy to pull. It looks like a clover, but it really isn't. Here we have a lawn area that is just about all wood sorrel and crabgrass. This is Indian mock strawberry. This is not native, and this is extremely difficult to control with herbicides. It's extremely difficult to control by hand pulling. The same can be said for our native or wild strawberry. It has white flowers, but otherwise is very similar. Very difficult to get rid of by hand pulling, very difficult to get rid of by herbicide. These are plants that you definitely want to use the right chemical at the right time of year to have any hope of effectively controlling them. Here we have more weeds that we run into. These are warm season weeds. Crabgrass we've talked about. In the center of the picture, going towards the right, is spurge. Spurge has a deep taproot, but it's not a thick taproot like a dandelion. It's very, very thin. So a lot of times when you go to pull it, it's easy to get the top growth, but the root will snap and stay in the ground, and it can resprout from that. Usually what I like to do is get under it and give it a twist. Again, moist soil is a better time to pull than when the soil is rock hard. This does have a latex-like sap that some people are sensitive to, so if you've never dealt with spurge before, I'd wear gloves when I was trying to hand pull it. Broadleaf plantains, they're a perennial. They're tricky to control chemically because of the waxy coating on their leaves. This is their cousin, the buckthorn plantain. Same issues there. This is white clover. White clover is a perennial. We saw this at the beginning. Clovers and grasses evolve together. In my view, they belong together. And so I don't consider them a weed. Again, some people do. The downside to clover is that every broadleaf herbicide can kill clover, which is terribly disappointing. But this is white clover. One thing you'll notice here, you see the ends of some of these cut grasses. They're not really cut, they're ripped. And that's because the person who mowed them used a dull mower blade. Other things you'll notice is these orange spots here and over here. That's rust. It's completely harmless. It just makes the grass look kind of orangey. Down here, it's not so much rust as it is leaf spot. Got a little bit of brown patch going on there. Nothing really too major. A little bit of leaf tip dieback. Again, nothing too major. Most of our fungal diseases in turf are cosmetic and won't kill the plant. So here we have wood sorrel on the right with a little open flower that's yellow. Here we have white clover, which has white flowers, as you might expect, that are kind of globe-shaped. You can see that they look similar, but they are definitely different. Wood sorrel, again, is not a clover. Clover family is beneficial to the grass because it puts out nitrogen into the soil, which means you don't have to use as much fertilizer. So another lookalike is black medic. And if you compare black medic with clover, black medic can look bigger than white clover. There's also some black medic that's got smaller leaves, but you can see how much darker the black medic leaves are. Medic is a clover as well, so even though it's a weed, it does put nitrogen into the soil. Another member of the clover family that can be troublesome is Lespedeza, sometimes called Korean clover. Lespedeza forms late spring, grows all summer. The longer it grows, the woodier it gets, the more difficult it is to control chemically, the more difficult it is to hand pull. If you're going to deal with Lespedeza, get it early, and if it's a small problem, hand pull it. If it's a larger problem, then chemicals might be a better option, but you can effectively get rid of Lespedeza by hand pulling repeatedly. On the right here edge, we have corn speedwell again, which we saw before. In most of the pictures showing dead nettle. Dead nettle is a mint. Dead nettle is a mint. It is an annual. It's relatively easy to control. I mean, you can just hand pull this. This isn't anything you really need to go crazy with herbicide with. Its cousin is henbit, which also produces little sort of fuchsia pink flowers. You can kind of see this over here on the extreme right. Again, mint, so it's going to be somewhat aggressive. This one's a little harder to hand pull and get the whole plant, but it's really not. That's relative. Both of them are relatively easy to get rid of. Here we have chickweed in henbit in a semi-dormant tall fescue. Again, just because something looks yellow doesn't mean it's dead. It could just be resting, and in this case, some of that tall fescue is. Let's look at the alliums. Alliums are members of the onion family. And the two weeds that we deal with in the onion family are wild garlic and, as you might imagine, wild onion. From a control point of view, it doesn't matter which one you're dealing with, but if you're really that interested, wild onions have flatter stems while wild garlic have more rounded, hollow stems. Chemical control of these guys is extremely difficult and often ineffective. The best way to get rid of these guys is to dig them out. Let's talk about moss really quickly. Moss is best removed by scraping it from the soil. There are mossicides out there, but they really aren't that terribly effective. 9 times out of 10, if you have moss in your yard, it's because you have too much shade in your yard. Now, there are times when it's sunny and you still have moss, and usually in that case, it's because the yard is too wet, too damp. So a little bit of improvement of the soil with surface drainage, dry that out, will give grass the competitive advantage it needs to overcome the moss. Moss is actually a very pretty plant. This is what it looks like up close. Now we mentioned soil testing. You can get soil tests from your local extension office and do it yourself and get a simple one-page report from the lab here in Virginia. It would be from the Virginia Tech Lab. Other states have state labs and other states don't have state labs, and you've got to go through private labs. Here in Virginia, if you're a Virginia resident, routine soil test costs about $10. However, you can spend $40 and not only will you get a soil test, you'll have a master gardener come out. They will measure and sample your yard for you. Again, knowing how much yard you have is important in knowing how much fertilizer to buy. They will compile what weeds you have. They will look at problem areas. When the soil test report comes back, Natalie Walker, our environmental educator, will get it. She'll take a look at it. She'll take a look at the master gardener notes, and she'll put together a multi-page report that is specific to your yard with a great deal of detail on how to manage your yard. So whereas the soil test report will tell you, oh, you probably need to add 50 pounds of lime per 1,000 square feet. The Best Lawns report will know how many square feet you have, and so it will tell you exactly how many pounds of lime to add. You can, if you're in Prince William County, Virginia, Best Lawns will work for you. If you're in the city of Manassas, the city of Manassas Park, Best Lawns works for you. If you're in the other Northern Virginia jurisdictions, it depends. Fairfax, Fauquier, Loudoun, and Stafford all have similar programs, but they're county specific. If you need to get a hold of the equivalent Best Lawn program in your county, send us an email and we'll get you in touch. If you're looking for participating in the Best Lawns program, send us an email at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. In our live broadcast, we had some questions, but we don't have time for that in our rebroadcast. If you enjoyed this program, please let us know with your questions, comments, and suggestions for other class. If you need more information on lawns and gardens or weeds to identify, contact the Extension Horticultural Help Desk at mastergardener@pwc.org.